In the collective consciousness of humanity, the majestic image of Sparta, a legendary polis whose glory has endured for millennia, still reigns supreme. However, should anyone venture to modern Greece in search of its proud remnants, they would be met with profound disappointment. Instead of monumental testaments to a once omnipotent city-state, travelers would encounter only scattered, modest ruins, barely hinting at its former grandeur. But what if it were possible to journey through time and find oneself in the living, breathing world of ancient Sparta? Surprisingly, this would not require traveling to such deep antiquity, as such a pilgrimage became a reality in the historical era itself. Many centuries after Sparta experienced its golden age of power and renown, this legendary city became a captivating hub for tourists from across the Mediterranean. Among these curious travelers was even Emperor Augustus himself, underscoring the place's incredible allure. What happened to a city that transformed from a formidable ancient superpower into a veritable tourist mecca? This fascinating metamorphosis, which occurred during the Roman era, many centuries after Sparta's rise and fall, warrants detailed examination. While one could begin the narrative with this astonishing phenomenon of ancient tourism, a full understanding of Sparta's destiny necessitates delving into its origins. Much like a meticulously planned tour that commences with foundational knowledge, our journey into the past must begin at the very dawn of Spartan history. Sparta's origins are rooted in the early Bronze Age, though development during that period was exceedingly slow and deliberate. It was only with the advent of the Archaic period that Sparta began its steady ascent to power, laying the groundwork for its future, highly controversial fame. The genesis of the Spartan state started with local processes, as numerous small settlements merged to form a relatively loose urban center, sharing many characteristics with other burgeoning city-states of the era. In the 8th to 7th centuries BC, they leveraged their combined strength to assert dominance over neighboring lands, first assimilating their immediate neighbors in Laconia and then subjugating Messenia. By the 6th century BC, Sparta seemingly underwent profound socio-political transformations, traditionally attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. However, modern scholarship suggests a more organic process led to the restructuring of the state apparatus and a clearer distinction between full citizens and the rest of the population, who were grouped into the classes of Helots and Perioik. Helots were essentially enslaved communities, concentrated around Sparta and Messenia, tied to the land, and possessing virtually no rights. Perioika, in contrast, were free but not full citizens from more distant areas of Spartan territory, holding only limited rights. Through these reforms, Sparta gained the internal stability necessary for further expanding its influence. Initially, expansion was achieved through direct military conquest, but it soon rapidly transformed into a complex foreign policy strategy involving the formation of a series of unequal alliances, which we call the Peloponnesian League. Its members were required to swear allegiance and follow the Spartans wherever they led. By the 5th century BC, the influence of the Peloponnesian League reached such colossal proportions that it unequivocally propelled Sparta to the forefront, as the undisputed leader of the entire Greek world. This offered the Lacedaemonians an unprecedented opportunity to attain the greatest glory during the momentous Greco-Persian Wars. Sparta's triumphant achievements on the battlefield, bolstered by skillful subsequent propaganda, further elevated them to the status of unquestionable authorities and true superstars in the ancient world's consciousness. Over the next few decades, they engaged in fierce conflict with Athens during the bloody Peloponnesian War, seeking to definitively determine who would be the undisputed hegemon of Greece. Ultimately, Sparta achieved a decisive victory, marking the apex of its power and prosperity. This final century was the period that would preserve their name in the annals of history for ages. It was this moment of greatness that every traveler undoubtedly hoped to witness when visiting the site of ancient Sparta long after its heyday had passed. However, had someone truly journeyed to those distant times, most observers would have been quite disappointed by what they saw. The eminent historian Thucydides, for instance, analyzes this paradoxical situation when he reflects in his works. Suppose, for example, that the city of Sparta were deserted, and only the temples and foundations of buildings remained. I think that future generations would find it extremely difficult in time to imagine that the place was really as powerful as it was described. Nevertheless, the Spartans controlled 2/5 of the Peloponnese and lead not only the entire Peloponnese but also vast allied territories and borderlands. However, since the city had no regular planning and did not abound in temples or monumental structures of great importance, but was rather a collection of scattered settlements according to the ancient Hellenic custom, its appearance would not match grand conceptions. In reality, the polis at that time primarily consisted of structures made of unbaked clay or wood, characterized by an almost complete absence of monumental architectural forms and even defensive walls. Thus, it becomes evident that the true origins of Spartan power lay in entirely different aspects than in the material display of strength. According to Plutarch, if anyone were to ask King Cleomenes about the city's true strength, he would undoubtedly declare, "Cities should be strengthened not with stones and timbers, but with the unbreakable virtues of their inhabitants." He would likely also add his famous, apt phrase that Sparta needed no city walls, for its true walls were its own armed citizens. However, to the great regret of the Spartan polis, it was precisely in this fundamental area that a deep and troubling crisis emerged. Around 500 BC, at the dawn of the Great Greco-Persian Wars, the adult male citizen population of Sparta was estimated at approximately 8,000. Yet, about a century later, by the time Sparta reached its zenith and dominated Greece, its citizen population had catastrophically dwindled to a few thousand. This decline was a direct consequence of numerous factors, including significant military losses, devastating natural disasters, and increasing wealth inequality, to name just a few. Consequently, Sparta's hegemony proved extremely fragile and unstable, lasting a mere 10 years before its power was overthrown by other rising powers, notably Thebes. The culmination of this decline was the crushing defeat the Spartans suffered at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. Following this, in the very next year, the distinguished Theban general Epaminondas invaded the Peloponnese at the head of an impressive army numbering 35,000 men. The ensuing series of powerful and decisive blows led many long-loyal Spartan allies to defect, and the Messenian Helots launched a large-scale revolt. Moreover, a new city, Megalopolis, was swiftly erected in Arcadia, primarily intended to curb Spartan ambitions. Sparta's power, once so swiftly ascended, collapsed even more suddenly and rapidly. Soon after these events, Philip of Macedon, with his reformed army, established complete control over Greece and, remarkably, did not even deem it necessary to exert effort to subjugate Sparta. In the subsequent era, the ancient city desperately clung to its former glory, attempting to overcome a profound crisis. For instance, Kings Agis IV and Cleomenes III initiated a complex set of reforms aimed at reviving Sparta's former strength. These measures included land redistribution, debt forgiveness, citizenship expansion, restoration of the Agoge training system, and generally represented attempts to make Sparta a great power once more. Although these efforts brought some success, the city was ultimately pushed back and suppressed by surrounding states. As a clear testament to its deep decline, Sparta was even forced to construct its first defensive walls. But even this could not halt the deteriorating situation. By the end of the 2nd century BC, Sparta was absorbed by the Achaean League, its walls were demolished, the Agoge was forbidden, and it was forced to adopt the customs and manners of its neighbors. In essence, the legendary Sparta ceased to exist. However, the memory of its glorious past lived on, and it was this fact that served as a catalyst for the polis's revival in the Roman era. The Romans initially came into contact with the Hellenistic world as they expanded their dominion over Italy and Sicily, but it was their wars against the successor kingdoms that brought them dominance in the Hellenic world. In these circumstances, Sparta managed to benefit from this shift in the balance of power and effectively joined Rome in the last major Greek uprising against the invaders. This decision proved far-sighted. When the rebellion was suppressed, Sparta was generously granted the status of a free city and finally, given the opportunity to revive its old customs and traditions, at least within what was acceptable to Roman provincial governors. Around this time, Sparta 2.0 began its process of revival. It faced the colossal task of reconstructing its former grandeur. For example, when the Roman general Lucius Aemilius Paulus visited Sparta to pay his respects, he found that little of their distinctive way of life remained, save for the characteristic clothing and unique hairstyles worn by the men. The ancient laws of Lycurgus had long fallen into disuse, and recent generations of Spartans had virtually no contact with their celebrated historical heritage. Only a few, those interested in the past, were teachers and philosophers who delved into Spartan history independently. However, as is often the case, their understanding was clouded by legends and filtered through their own preconceptions. Thus, the designs of Sparta 2.0 largely constituted a parody of a fictional reality rather than a genuine revival. Initially, Sparta made some progress during a brief period of stable Roman rule. However, this relative calm was soon undermined by the internecine conflicts of the 1st century BC, which led to armies passing freely throughout Greece, draining significant human and material resources. Fortunately for Sparta, it once again supported the victor, Augustus. When the triumphant general ascended to the imperial throne, he paid special attention to the city, honoring it with a personal visit in 22 BC. As always with Augustus, however, this move was dictated by veiled objectives. He sought to restore the integrity of the shattered republic, positioning himself as a conservative ruler capable of bringing back pre-war stability. Associating himself with Sparta, which was rightly considered the ultimate conservative symbol, was precisely what he needed. However, there was a slight hitch. As already mentioned, Sparta was only beginning its revival and was unable to fully demonstrate its supposed conservative coolness. But this was something the ruler could undoubtedly help with. Augustus arrived in Sparta not only for a courtesy visit but with the clear aim of providing financial support. During his stay, he presented himself as a wealthy traveler, observing the Agoj contests with interest and sharing meals in the common dining hall, all while sparing no expense. This act initiated an unprecedented tradition, subsequently followed by future emperors and other prominent members of the Roman elite. Soon, a mutually beneficial relationship developed between Rome and Sparta. Visitors flocked to the city to sponsor its activities, and Sparta, in turn, offered them a fragment of authentic Spartan life. The more authentic this experience appeared, the more it was valued. It is not difficult to imagine how this unfolded. Essentially, a peculiar tourist attraction, or as we would say today, a tourist trap, emerged. So, what was this famous Spartan experience? It must be admitted that its exact details remain largely unknown. Initially, tourists may have been limited to observing the city's daily routine. It seems there was even a specialized guest house capable of accommodating visitors who came to the city precisely for this purpose. Probably among the most sought-after spectacles was observing the Agoj routine. As mentioned, over time, this ritual became even more spectacular and intense than ever before. For example, they spoke of an ancient Spartan tradition known as the flogging, or diamastagosis, intended to commemorate a historical episode when young Spartans defended a sanctuary from Thracian barbarians armed only with reed sticks. This event, according to tradition, involved the following ritual. 17-year-old cohorts undergoing the Agoj were given canes and instructed to defend the temple of Apollo from 16-year-old youths, who were unarmed and tasked with stealing cheeses stored inside. Whoever managed to penetrate and acquire the most cheese was crowned champion, and their blood was then used for ritual consecration in the temple of Apollo Artemis. However, in the era known as Sparta 2.0, this once ritual event transformed into a significantly harsher and more ruthless practice. Youths standing inside the temple were subjected to relentless whipping, with the sole criterion for victory being exceptional endurance. Only the last one standing was proclaimed champion. There were no games or symbolic cheese thefts here, only pure, unadulterated pain. Such a spectacle undoubtedly enjoyed immense success with numerous tourists, who could only gaze in awe at the demonstration of unparalleled resilience and courage. Now, before their eyes, was the very Sparta they had heard legends about, not fabricated tales of children stealing cheeses, but a reality where young men were flogged almost to unconsciousness. For many centuries, the city proudly solidified its new, brutal identity. With the increasing influx of financial resources and attention, the old, modest Sparta, built of clay, underwent a grand transformation. New public buildings were erected everywhere, majestic monuments were installed, temples were expanded, and all sorts of improvements were implemented to ensure a continuous flow of visitors. For example, to make the harshagoge training more accessible to the general public, a special arena was built outside the Temple of Artemis. Here, spectators could comfortably sit on richly decorated stands adorned with statues of famous Spartan champions and observe the daily training and intense competitions of the youth striving to earn the honor of being included in the cherished list of heroes. Some foreigners, it is reported, were so deeply impressed by this spectacle and the educational system that they even began sending their own sons to train in the agoge. Another significant and extremely popular attraction in Sparta 2.0 was undoubtedly its numerous religious festivals. The three ancient celebrations, the Hyacinthia, Carnia, and Gymnopaedia, when combined, apparently drew countless crowds of admirers and spectators. The Hyacinthia was dedicated to the preservation and revival of ancient song traditions and choreographic forms, and also included various games, both on foot and on horseback. The Carnia, in this historical period, was primarily described as a set of athletic contests, whose victor was granted the honorable right to have his own statue erected. And finally, the Gymnopaedia served as a celebration of Spartan youth, whose representatives collectively offered hymns of praise to Apollo, performed ritual dances, and demonstrated extraordinary skill in martial arts and athletic competitions. As if this were not enough to maintain national spirit and attract attention, when the Second Sophistic movement began in the 2nd century CE, marking a revival of Greek heroization of the past, Sparta introduced a completely new celebration. This festival was named Leonidiae and was intended to commemorate the glory of the valiant heroes of antiquity, Leonidas and Pausanias, who bravely fought against the Persians. During this festival, inspiring speeches were delivered in memory of the fallen heroes, and athletic games were held in which only Spartan citizens could compete. All of this began with unprecedented grandeur, as it coincided with the start of Trajan's large-scale campaigns against the Parthians in the east. Imperial propaganda reached its peak, and a substantial prize fund of 120,000 sesterces undoubtedly ensured widespread agreement with the said agenda. Thanks to a series of significant events, Sparta 2.0 gradually emerged from historical obscurity, managing to secure relatively important economic and political positions on the Greek peninsula. However, such a notable revival could not occur without substantial costs. As previously noted, to maintain continuous public interest, Sparta was forced to become an even more elaborate parody of its famed predecessor. Such a necessity required significant resources, leading to the introduction of special taxes designed to secure sufficient funding from the city's wealthiest and most prominent residents to stabilize the city budget. Nevertheless, the numerous streams of people drawn by developed tourism, especially during popular festivals, sometimes significantly depleted the city's coffers. For example, intense pedestrian and chariot traffic led to rapid wear and tear of road surfaces, requiring constant maintenance efforts from local residents. Among other things, sharp surges in population regularly caused food shortages, which, in turn, steadily kept prices for basic foodstuffs high. 10 surviving inscriptions, dating exclusively to the 2nd century, serve as direct evidence of food scarcity, to which 2 more are added, discovered during an accidental visit by Hadrian. Sparta, clearly, found itself in a very difficult situation. Historical trends seemed to relentlessly push it to exert ever greater efforts to maintain its once formidable image, which over time became an increasingly insurmountable task. This circumstance could also raise a legitimate question for observers: what was the true purpose of all these efforts? During that period, Sparta no longer possessed genuine military might, and did not participate in large-scale conflicts that could serve to hone its combat skills. At best, historical evidence indicates its sporadic provision of contingents for the needs of the Roman army. However, this never took the form of a grandiose deployment of a crimson detachment of Spartan super-soldier hoplites capable of changing the course of battle on the field. A vivid example of this degradation occurred in 214 CE, when Emperor Caracalla, preparing for a large-scale military campaign against the Parthian Empire, enlisted a small Spartan cohort, numbering only 500 warriors. Although Herodian describes them as a phalanx in his works, archaeological data, particularly funerary inscriptions, rather indicate that these warriors were effectively deployed as lightly armed units, and their further actions and fate remain largely unrecorded in historical sources. Undeniable evidence of Sparta's military inadequacy was the rout of its militia by a band of Visigothic raiders, who freely plundered the city in 396 CE. Although Sparta was subsequently rebuilt, it was merely a diminished and significantly faded shadow of its former glory, and within the next century, it completely fell into desolation. The center of regional influence shifted to other geographical points, and it was only in the 1800s that a modern city, named Sparta, was founded on the site of its ancient ruins. It is in this place today that the Sparta one could call its third incarnation is located. Concluding the narrative of Sparta's rise and fall, one hopes that the presented material proved engaging for the reader. For ancient historians, it has been a surprising discovery to observe how this polis structure underwent significant transformations over centuries. Particularly astonishing is the fact that Sparta functioned as a kind of ancient tourist center for considerably longer than it operated as a dominant military power. This circumstance gains particular relevance when it is revealed that a significant portion of the understanding of early Sparta, termed Sparta 1.0, is drawn from historical sources describing its later and entirely different iteration, Sparta 2.0, which acquired characteristics similar to a modern theme park. Such an understanding is expected to deepen the context for studying other materials concerning phenomena like the Spartan mirage. These studies aim to uncover the authentic, less distorted, and uncaricatured history of Sparta 1.0 through the tireless efforts of modern historians.